So welcome. Where's the camera? The camera's over here.
Stand right in front of
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Joe has been with us. Joe Montoya has been with us for how long?
2 years almost now.
Two years almost, and he's been in the lab. And I think you were introduced to me by Dr. Porter, and I guess we adopted you into the lab. So you'll find that Joe has he has a real background in agriculture, went to Utah State, and then has managed a refugee garden, pretty big, like 3 acres or something like that. And he'll talk about it. And he's been in agricultural education. So his ag background is a lot better than ours. And Joe also brings an economics, he has a master's in ag economics as well. So he brings that background along. So his presentation today is going to be based on some data we've been collecting over the last 8 or 9 years of a farm that I started working with. And this is part of a case study that we have going on. What I like about it is that Joe brings his particular economist's bent to it. So he looks at the data a little bit differently to what I do, which is fantastic. So the other thing I think Joe does bring out in this, and that I always like to pitch, is we've got a real soil scientist with us now, and one of the, which is fantastic. And one of the things we want to pitch is the idea that soil health is environmental health. I'm an aquatic scientist by training, but so my entire I was consumed by the idea of how much time, how many field borders and filter strips and buffer strips do we put in to fix the water. And then I found out that if we fix the land, increase infiltration, increase nutrient cycling, the water will take care of itself. So soil health is to field borders and filter strips as public health would be, or preventative health would be to injections and tablets and pills, things like that. So that's kind of the idea that we want. I certainly haven't developed that fully, but I'm hoping that younger and better minds than mine would be able to develop that idea. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Should I get my PowerPoint going on here? Or?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Buzz. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I have really benefited from being here. I said 2 years, and then I thought, is that right? December 2021, I think, is when I started in the lab.
Okay.
So that would be almost 2 years. It's kind of crazy to think that. And I have, like Buzz said, I need to start out. I am not an economist. To be an economist, you have to have it's more like getting a PhD in economics. I have a master's degree in applied economics, which is very helpful and really helps me to look at the world through a different lens, through the lens of balancing risks. I think the people who are closest to me get annoyed because that's typically when it's time to make a decision. I start to balance the risks and say, oh, we're doing a risk analysis here. But I'm really excited to be able to speak to all of you. I like that this is kind of a cozy setting. And I hope that this will give me the opportunity to get to know some more of you and to have you familiarize yourself with the work that I'm doing. So I'm going to jump right in. Let's see. I've got my laser pointer going. Okay, so I wanted to do... Does it disappear? That is a very good question. There we go. Awesome. So I've got a couple pictures here from the Student Organic Farm at Utah State, and I have a bad habit of pacing. So I will try to stay right here in front of the camera and not walk out into the room. But I'll probably have to remind myself a few times. So during my undergraduate degree, I worked on a few different organic farms, and so that was my foundation in agriculture. I didn't grow up on a farm. My parents didn't like gardening. I really got into agriculture when I was an undergraduate. and was able to work at a couple really cool spots and learned organic food production. And I also worked on a flower. It wasn't a farm; it was more of a greenhouse setting. But got some really great experience doing those things. And then my undergraduate degree was in agricultural education. Originally, it was going to be horticulture, and then I just loved teaching. And so I ended up going into ag education, and I taught at a very small, urban, farm-based charter high school. So we grew about an acre and a half of vegetables. It was entirely student-driven, so I managed most of it with the help of others, and then the students did all the work, which was really kind of an interesting setup. And I loved that. Decided that I wanted to get out of public education because of the kind of the burden of bureaucracy that's involved. I wanted to start my own farm, so I went to Utah State, got a master's degree in applied economics and agribusiness. Basically, the whole time, every time we'd introduce ourselves in a class, they'd ask, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I'd say, "I want to start a small vegetable farm. I want to learn how to run a small vegetable farm." And they would say, "I think what you're going to learn through this degree is that you can't make a living running a small vegetable farm." And so that really kind of got me thinking and got the wheels turning. And I worked at some other farms, at one particular here in Columbia, and then met up with Buzz and realized that probably for me the best way to keep my hand in agriculture and also in education, and to do something with food, was to get a PhD, because that way my hope is that I can help remove some of the barriers for farmers who want to, people who want to grow food for others. And there are a lot of barriers, and so I wanted to help remove some of those. And in this program, I've realized that that's a public health issue. It really is. Food production is a public health issue, and it's also very much an environmental health issue. So the current work that I'm doing, I have the opportunity to work with a number of farmers who are practicing what we call regenerative agriculture principles. Most of them, their reasons for doing so is usually different than our reasons. So the data that we look at sometimes is economic data. Typically, it's environmental data. We do a lot of soil tests. We look at soil health. And so these farmers inadvertently are having a positive impact on the environment, whether or not that's the reason they got into regenerative agriculture. So my objectives for this presentation, like I said, I hope this is a good introduction for all of us, but I also I want to explore one particular farm in South Carolina that's using regenerative agricultural principles and talk about how and why they're doing that. And then I want to take a look at the economic benefits. I think that the economics really fit into the public health sphere and the environmental health sphere. It's an important thing to mention when you're talking about public and environmental health. And then I want to look at some of the environmental benefits as well. So this is a picture of Sonny Price. He's a farmer he's got area in South Carolina and North Carolina. And him and his brother run the family farm that they've been running since, I think, 1961 or something like that. So they have about 357 fields spread out in Dillon County and Marlborough County. Marlborough is in North Carolina. It's about 6,500 acres. And they grow corn, wheat, cotton, soybeans, and other plants in rotation. And their business model uses economies of scale. So the way that works is if you are a row crop farmer like this, it might cost you $750 to grow an acre of corn, but you might be able to make $850 on that acre of corn in a good year. These are just kind of numbers I'm throwing out. And so you would make $100 on that acre. So if you have, that would be a really good year. If you have 6,500 acres, you're going to make quite a bit of money. Typically, it doesn't work out that well for the farmers. And so the more acres you can have, in theory, the more money you can make. And so they pretty much, however many acres they can get to with their machinery and their resources, they try to do as many as possible. And they have been practicing regenerative agriculture since around 2013. And regenerative agriculture, we'll talk more about it later, but you operate on a scale. So you're not always like, there's not a hard line. So they've been implementing things and doing lots of experimentation. I want to take a step back real quick and talk about how this affects all of us, because I think when we talk about agriculture, we don't often look at the big picture, but this affects you and me. They grow, I mentioned they grow cotton. Cotton is used for bookbinding, for clothing, for coffee filters, for lots of different things. If you have cotton in your clothing, it may or may not have been grown in the Southeast. Wheat, they grow wheat. It's used for, that goes to mills and may end up in grocery stores. We grow hard red wheat here, or soft red wheat here, so it's not the kind you necessarily be using for bread, but it might end up in some of the foods you eat. And then they grow field corn and soybeans, which is mostly used for animal feed. So that's going to be sold to the animal production farms. And so if you've been to Zaxby's and had a chicken sandwich, there's a chance that the chicken that you're eating was eating field corn from a farm in South Carolina. So this really does affect all of us. It's part of the system that we belong to. Let's take a minute and talk about regenerative agriculture. So this isn't an image that we've put out, but I really like it because it's a little bit busy, but I think it does a good job of talking about the principles of regenerative agriculture. So I want to start with diversity, and I'll get more into these in future slides. So I'm going to kind of skim over this, but part of regenerative agriculture is introducing more diversity. So we hear a lot about monocultures. If you drive in the Midwest, you'll see fields and fields of corn. And when you're practicing regenerative agriculture, you want to introduce more plants. So that might be companion planting, it might be crop rotations, but you want to increase your diversity. You want to protect your soil surface. So bare soil is not something that you want in regenerative agriculture. You want to minimize your soil disturbance because soil takes time to develop. It's good structure, and good structure is important for water retention and nutrient, holding on to nutrients and things like that. And then livestock integration plays a huge role. And there's one particular farm that we're working with that is using livestock integration. I won't be talking about that one today. So what this looks like, you see this, can you see my pointer here? So this image is of somebody using a tiller attached to a tractor. And you can see that as they go, they pretty much tear up any plants that are there, and they leave bare soil behind. And this is pretty traditional. When people are farming, they use a tiller and they call it preparing the seedbed. And so that's pretty normal. And with regenerative agriculture, you want to minimize that soil disturbance. So you're going to use low or no till. So this second image here is a tractor using what's called strip tilling. So there is some tilling happening here. You've got these rows that are being tilled, and those look like fairly wide rows. They can be even narrower than that. And then the seeds will go, this tractor's dropping seeds into those rows, and they'll go right in those rows. And you can see there's plants in between, there's green material. And so later, that green material you'd want something that's going to die off. And so this is that grass in the in-between rows, and then these are the crops. This new green plant is the crop that's growing up, and so you've got this soil cover, which is incredibly beneficial. Is that a question?
I think that was Jones just talking.
Okay, gotcha. By the way, I meant to mention, if anybody has any questions, I'd love to hear them and make this a discussion if you're interested. Keep having issues with my going to the next slide. Here we go. I wanted to talk a little bit about crop rotations. So this is a very simplified version of a crop rotation, but I've got the months of the year out in a circle. And so you might plant corn in early April, and that will grow until the end of July. You'd harvest that. You'd plant soybeans. Those would go until the end of October, and then you'd have a winter cover crop while your field rests, and that cover crop would be there and occupy that field until you're ready to plant again. Now, a lot of rotations are on a 2-year rotation, so it wouldn't quite be this simple, but just to illustrate that principle, you're going to be planting multiple crops throughout the year, and one of those is going to be a cover crop. And often those cover crops, like I said, you want to increase diversity. So they're going to be multi-species. You're going to be growing different grasses and legumes and other things that are going to benefit your land. And then you want to reduce your pesticide and herbicide inputs as much as possible. So on the left here, we have an image of a tractor spraying, applying some sort of fertilizer or pesticide or herbicide. And in regenerative agriculture, you want to minimize that as much as possible. You're going to use your cover crops as a way of binding your nutrients and holding onto them and increasing the fertility of your field, as well as suppressing weeds and hopefully finding a balance with your pests. So what this, how this works is that when you keep a live root in the soil, when you have a cover crop in between your cash crops, rather than just bare soil, you're going to increase your soil organic matter. Your plants are always photosynthesizing. So they're taking energy from the sun, they're turning that into sugar, and they're absorbing carbon from the air. And so that carbon and those sugars are often going down into the soil. They say that up to sometimes 50 to 60% of the carbon and sugars that plants are absorbing goes down into the soil. So it maintains carbon stores, it pulls carbon out of the air, and it feeds the soils. The soils, a healthy soil, a well-fed soil is an incredibly productive thing. And then reducing tillage. So soil structure is incredibly important. Plant roots need structure to be able to reach down and to get water and nutrients. When you're not tilling, you're keeping those soil structures in place. And then there's a whole, I mean, we could talk forever about bacteria and fungi, the communities that are in soils. And when you till soils, you destroy those. And those are beneficial for plants. You want to maintain those and to maintain your nutrient gradient. And then reducing chemical application, it really helps to, again, to keep carbon in the soil, to keep it from solubilizing and going back into the atmosphere, or leaching into groundwater, and lets the biology that's there do its job. And so essentially what this means for the farmer is that their chemical fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, all of these things cost a lot of money. And so if a farmer is able to plant cover crops and not use these things, that's essentially money in their pocket. And so if a farmer is practicing regenerative agricultural principles, they are going to make a higher return on their crop than their neighbors across the fence who are spraying and applying expensive chemicals, in theory. But then the question is, well, then why isn't everybody doing it if it's working, if it's that straightforward? And like I said, I have to look at the world through a risk management lens. Whenever anybody makes a decision, they're balancing their risks, and some people are more risk averse, some people are more risk loving. Farmers tend to be somewhat risk averse, but farming is really risky. And it's a high risk because you can lose a crop to a hailstorm, and you've put thousands of dollars into that crop and you don't get anything back. And so making a conscious change, saying something like, well, I'm not going to apply fertilizers, is incredibly risky for a farmer to contemplate. Because if they don't get a crop, then they don't get an income. So traditional wisdom really says you have to add fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides to get a crop. If you don't, you're not gonna make any money. The term mining is used sometimes, that there are nutrients in the soil, and if you don't apply fertilizers, you're going to mine those nutrients, you're going to pull them up as you remove your crop. Nothing's going back to replace them. And so some people will say, well, this will work for a year or two, but it's not really going to work beyond that, because you're going to eventually have to add those fertilizers back. And then farmers have very small margins, so even a small change can have a huge impact on their income. I have contract stipulations as well. A lot of farmers don't. So that example of $750 cost, $850 return, that's not terribly realistic all the time. Sometimes it's, cents per bushel. You're making a few cents. And so if you have a bad year, if you don't get enough rain, you're actually spending more to produce your crop than you're making. And so then we have things like crop insurances, where if we can prove that something went wrong with nature, you're still going to get paid for your crop because we need food. But you have to be able to prove that you did everything that you could. And if you said, well, I didn't apply fertilizers this year, you're probably not going to get a crop insurance payout. And so, like I said, there's just very little room for error. There's a lot going on here. So let me break this down. What we've been doing to see if this is worth it, and to see if the risk management, if this is going to be a good idea for farmers, is we've been looking at a lot of different numbers. We've been analyzing the data so that we can paint a clear picture of whether, and understand whether or not this is a good thing. So we do a lot of soil testing, and these numbers are soil test numbers for 31 fields on the Price farms. There's a few, there's a lot of things here, but we look a lot at soil pH. We look a lot at phosphorus and potassium. So these are phosphorus and potassium numbers, pounds per acre, for different years for these fields. We've got some other trace nutrients. Organic matter is a big one, because organic matter can be translated straight into carbon amounts. And so those are significant things to look at. And then this analysis in particular, we were looking at changes in soil tests from year to year. And we used this Fisher's least significant difference to analyze this data, which is it's a post hoc test. So you do your normal ANOVA test, and then you get essentially this t-test for each value. And it makes it so that you can look at values between years or between sample groups and see if there's a significance. So we're not just looking at, is there a significant difference between soil pH in 2015 and 2021, but is there a difference between 2015 and 2016 and 2016 and 2017? We can use this least significant difference to analyze whether or not things have changed from year to year. And that's important, that's useful for us because you get a lot of variation when you're sampling soil. And so some years, something might increase and then it'll decrease the next year and then it'll increase again. And it's important to look at these differences. So we look a lot at organic matter. Organic matter is a really great indication of soil health. And this is organic matter increases since 2015. We saw that there was a significant difference. That looks pretty good. And that can translate directly into carbon that's being pulled from the atmosphere and stored in the soil. So that's a good thing. We also look at yields. So right here I have the price farms are the blue dots. And then the county averages are the orange dots. And these, they bounce around from year to year, but they follow a fairly close trend. In some years, a lot of years actually, the price farm yield was better than the county average. And that comes down to the farmer's skill and other things. But I also have the percentage yield comparison. So the county average is 0%. And then the price farm yield kind of bounces around that. I love cotton here. This is like pretty much best case scenario when you're doing research and you want to see if something is working. This upward trend of cotton as regenerative principles increase, cotton yield is increasing. That's a pretty good. It's not definitive, but it looks nice. Okay, so I want to make sure I'm pacing myself accurately. Okay. I want to talk about agronomic principles because the economics are really important, and there's a few steps that we need to get to analyzing the economics. So bear with me. Please raise your hand if you have a question. And the same goes for the Zoom people on Zoom. So these are those soil test numbers again. And for this example, I just want to focus on we're gonna look at P and K. So these are nutrients that plants need, phosphorus and potassium, that plants need to grow. And we have a value of 103 for P and a value of 200 for K. And what we're going to do with those numbers is we're going to look at every land-grant university will put out a soil nutrient level management document that they will issue to farmers, and farmers with the help of an agronomist, either an extension specialist or a professional agronomist, private industry. We'll look at those numbers and we'll give a recommendation of how much fertilizer they need to add to their land to be able to grow their crop. And so, like I said, we had 103 for P, 200 for K, and we're in soil group 3. So we're going to look at this category here, and 103 puts us in the high group for P, and it puts us in the high group for K. Now that's not always the case. Sometimes you'll end up in medium and sufficient or different things. But right now, what we're looking at, we're in the high group. And so high, if we're in the high group, this is another part of that document. And we want to grow 160 bushels of corn. We need to add 180 pounds of nitrogen, 0 pounds of P, and 30 pounds of K. And that's per acre. So these, if you don't follow all that, that's okay. These translate to costs. So if you're here in the low, you're adding a lot more nutrients than you are here. And so essentially we're saving money here. Now, those soil health tests that I showed you didn't take nitrogen into consideration at all. In fact, most of our tests, we haven't looked at nitrogen levels. And so with corn, these agronomist recommendations are just going to tell you 180 pounds of nitrogen no matter what. That's just what they're going to say. It doesn't matter what your nitrogen levels look like. And then what we've done is we've taken all of these numbers, how much fertilizer we need to add for every single field, and we've added them all up, and so it becomes this kind of huge document, and we get this spit out that tells us okay, how much nitrogen in 2015 did they have to add, or was recommended that they add by these agronomists' recommendations. So I've got NP and K here on the graph. And we see something very, very interesting when we start to analyze this data from the price farms. We see that as time goes on, these recommendations of P and K drop to almost zero, which is really significant. Yes, Buzz?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, did you mention that they had not applied phosphorus and
I
potassium?
haven't yet, but I think, yeah, I think that's significant that in 2015 and 2016 they weren't adding P and K, but still their recommended levels of P and K have dropped. If you're an agronomist and you're going to this farm, you're going to say, well, whatever you're doing is working, because we're showing that your soil tests say we don't need to add any P and K. And this is highly unusual, because if you're doing conventional farming or even organic agriculture, you're going to be adding fertility, you're going to be adding nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium every year. And you're going to go and add it. Your plants are going to use it up, and you're going to harvest those plants, and you're going to take your soil tests. And again, you're going to be told, okay, now we have to add it again next year. And then and so this is like a cycle where we have to add over and over and over. So this is highly unusual. When we see something like this, we get really excited, because something's going on here. I didn't talk a lot about pH, but when pH drops, you have to add lime to your soil. That increases the pH. And these are the lime recommendations. I have an average, and then I have a 2-year moving average, because we had this drop and this spike. And you can see that that's also trending downward. And so it's just incredibly interesting that these values are dropping. And so what I did with that data is I looked at the historic costs. This is where I started nerding out and doing my ag econ, got that hat on. And I looked at historic prices for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and lime over since 2015. And that's what this bottom left chart shows. So they vary a little bit, these prices. They really jumped up in 2021 because of the war in Ukraine. So things got a little bit more, or a lot more expensive. And then I took these historic prices, cost per pound, and applied them to this prescription. And you can see what the recommended prices are, or the recommended costs for each year. We can kind of estimate what the economics would have been if we'd followed these agronomic recommendations. And then I have a chart here that shows the actual, as far as we've been able to estimate the actual current costs. So we have nitrogen here is bouncing around based on these historic costs. And then you have the cover crop, which really stays pretty solid all the time. And then chicken litter, which they didn't really start applying in most of the fields that we sampled in 2017. So you have these costs. And I loved when we were meeting with the farmer, because they don't apply nitrogen according to the recommendation. So this blue line here kind of shoots up. They apply nitrogen according to, I don't know exactly how the decision-making process works for them, but they use their years and years of experience to come up with how much nitrogen they're going to apply to those fields. And it's significantly less. And so when we were visiting with these farmers the last time, one of them, Sunny Price, said, when nitrogen costs went up, that's all the boys around here were talking about. Tony and I went home and went to bed. And I think that really illustrates that these principles are helping them to have a better state of mind when it comes to farming and some of the volatility that can occur. So I before I get into that next chart, this gets really tricky, because as the principles that they use make it so that their recommendations drop. So the P and K. Oh yes. Yeah. So you're asking about, like, the cover crop is putting nitrogen into the soil from the atmosphere, and so those costs are. It's not expressly presented here, but I think that's a big reason why their nitrogen costs are or why they apply so little nitrogen. And again, I don't know all the mechanisms that go into the way that they decide how much nitrogen to put down, but I do know that they are definitely not going based on the Clemson recommendations.
To answer your question directly, though, those are the actual nitrogen costs that
that's what we've observed. Yeah.
So what they're doing is they're accounting for some of the cover crop nitrogen in the soil.
And I think that would be a really interesting thing to dig more into, is to see what effect that the cover crop is having on the amount of nitrogen that they need to put down. They also apply chicken litter in their fields, and so I think I put that in here. There's gonna be quite a bit of nitrogen in that. But no, I don't have it's kind of hidden in the data somewhere, but I don't have yeah, that was a good question. Thank you. So it becomes really difficult to compare a farm that's using regenerative principles to a more conventional farm, because as I've shown you, the recommendations are dropping. And so if we were to actually look at how much they're spending compared to how much it's recommended that they spend, the recommendations from the agronomy point of view is less. It's going to cost less to do, like if they were to pick up applying nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium at the recommended rates right now, they would actually save money, which is really perplexing and kind of confusing. But it makes it so that essentially we're comparing apples and oranges. And so to have some sort of a baseline, I use the crop budgets that Clemson puts out. And again, every extension university is going to put crop budgets out. And these are estimates of how much it's going to cost a farmer to grow. This is non-irrigated corn, 160 bushels an acre. And it's going to tell you how much every little thing is going to cost. And I kind of customized these, and I used the historic cost that I had, and I came up with this information. So we have the estimated actual costs. Those are, if I can show you, those are based on this chart here. So our estimated actual costs. And then I use that crop budget as a baseline, and we see that our estimated actual costs are quite a bit lower than our crop budget. So, and for most years they're not always, but an average of $25 per acre lower than if we were using the crop budget. These agronomic recommendations, I throw this in here for illustrative purposes. It says that it's significantly lower than the actual costs, but again, it's not indicative of what's happening, because essentially what we're being told is that we've broken the system of having to add nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium every single year, and having the plants absorb that and then having to apply again is being turned on its head. And so these farmers have actually told us, like, they'll have an agronomist come out and they'll say, how little nitrogen did you put on this field? You put some, but you put 1 unit, and we would have recommended 3. And they'll look at the crops and they'll say, this doesn't measure up. Like these crops should not look like this with how little nitrogen you put down. And then they'll say, well, this goes against everything that I know, but I would say you don't need to add any P or K based on these crops, which is kind of fun when people who have been doing this their whole lives look at a field and say, this isn't measuring up. So essentially we can't draw any conclusions yet, but it feels like it's working against the system. Yes, Buzz.
Can you just go back to the previous one?
Oh, yes.
I guess a question that I would have is, and I guess I know the answer, but unless you're going to deal with this later on, how come the actual costs are higher than your ag recommendation? What 2 elements are you adding in there that make those costs higher than your fertilizer costs?
That's a great question. So that would, there's a couple things. You're applying chicken litter, so you have to purchase the chicken litter and the application of that costs money per acre. And then the cover crop seeds. And there's a couple other things that we factored in that are represented by that value. And so, I mean, we can't just go in and say, like, you're not paying anything for nutrients or paying very little for nutrients. So let's just look at those values. There's some things that we're replacing adding nutrients with, like adding chicken litter and planting cover crops. And so I've used those to estimate this value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I want to clarify because looking at it without necessarily the context, that does not make sense. But if you like you say, you're comparing apples and oranges. You're looking at the cover crop seed and the chicken litter seed versus pure commercial chemical fertilizer.
Yeah. And the first time that we looked at these numbers, I mean, I put all these together. I spent lots of hours compiling information, and then I finally spat out my graph, and I was like, why is the agronomic recommendation lower than our estimated actual. That just didn't line up for me. It didn't make any sense. And then I realized it was because these values were dropping so drastically. It just, yeah, it just doesn't, it's a totally different system. And so we had to kind of go back and rethink how we were looking at things to be able to make these comparisons. Because if they were to, if the prices were to stop using the regenerative principles today and go back to a conventional farm, they would have to go back to adding nutrients. And so it really is just a difference. It's a very big difference. And so then just some other benefits to tie things back into environmental and public health. One of the farmers I loved, we were chatting, and he said, the cover crops kill the pigweed. And that's something that they've fought with for years and years and years, and applied lots of different chemicals. And when they're applying those chemicals, they're designed to kill plants, and they're getting out into the environment. And so being able to save money and not apply these chemicals and put them out into the environment is a huge benefit. And that's quite a bit of money that they're saving. Additionally, their farm, because they have a living root in the soil, because they have these cover crops, they're going to retain more water. So when it rains, that water is going to stay there. It's not going to run off. The water runoff is a huge contributor to soil compaction and soil erosion. And so soils, we're constantly losing them to the sewer system because rain falls on bare soil and it moves that soil off. That's not happening where these cover crops are being planted. The nutrient runoff is a huge one. We talk a lot about harmful algae blooms. And a lot of times we can trace those, not every time, but we can trace those back to nitrogen fertilizers that are being over-applied, that are being absorbed by rainwater and moving down through watersheds and into places like the Gulf of Mexico, where these nutrients, these nitrogen fertilizers are hitting these waterways. They're creating these big jumps in the amount of algae that can grow because those nutrients are there, and then they deplete they have all sorts of bad impacts. And so if you're reducing your chemical inputs, you're reducing these problems. It's also estimated that because so much carbon is being stored in the soil, that your carbon emissions are dropping pretty drastically when you look at your footprint and your balance. And so I think that this is really insightful. Agriculture contributes to 11% of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., and that's broken down in this second chart. And direct CO2 is not a huge part of it, but it is definitely a chunk of this. And then if you look at, this is individual carbon footprint values. 56% of most people's carbon footprint comes from eating meat. And so if the animal feed that's being grown by a farm is being grown regeneratively, is having a smaller carbon footprint, then this number is going to start to drop. And so as more farmers adopt this, it's having a very real impact, not only on environmental health, but on public health. And I think that's important to mention. And then this chart here on the left, or this represents data that's been gathered by soil health labs and published that shows a number of different farms and data points where carbon has actually been stored in the soil and is making an impact on the amount of carbon that's going out in the atmosphere. And then I wanted to throw this in because this is a rainwater simulation. So there's a number of different soils that are and different soil treatments that are being tested here. And water is being sprayed on them to mimic a heavy rainfall event. And you can see on the bare soil, you've got a lot more water that's running off. You've got a lot more soil in there. There's a cover crop here, there's ground cover, and then these would be from a pasture system. But you're saving yourself from losing your soils and your waters. So just to recap in conclusion, it seems evident that using regenerative agriculture principles on a row crop farm is a viable option. You can still have good yields. Hopefully, if it's being done right, farmers aren't going to be losing any money. Our early economic analysis suggests that it's possible to actually make more money or to save money using these principles. And the data suggests that we can sequester carbon and reduce environmental runoff. So I guess at the end here, I mean, we'll jump into questions, but I want to ask everybody what their thoughts are about, is it worth the risks? Does it seem, I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of a farmer, this might seem like, yeah, let's go and change everything we're doing. But anytime we make a change, it's difficult. Do you all feel like this adds up? Is it worth the risk? And do you have any questions?
Well, first a round of applause.
Yeah.
Question about the tilling. So whenever you were talking about tilling, you said that you want the cover plant to die, right? So why is that?
So the question was, when you're tilling, you want to till up the plants that are there. Is that right?
Yeah,
and why is that?
You showed a picture after the tilling was done and the crop starts growing, where you want the cover plant to die, but it still covers.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we've been doing that for a long time, like probably over 100 years now that we've been tilling so that it's bare soil. I think a big part of it is to prepare the soil for the plants to optimize growth. So if you plant a corn crop in a bunch of weeds, there's a good chance that those weeds will choke out that corn plant and you're not going to get a good crop. And so when you're selecting cover crops, you really have to be careful about which crops you're planting, to make sure that your cover crop is not competing with your cash crop. And so traditionally you just destroy whatever's there and then you plant your crop. And then it's just ready for optimal growth. Does that answer that question? Okay. But yeah, I mean, when you start to look at regenerative principles and you talk to farmers, it's like, but why? Yeah, this doesn't make any sense. Shouldn't there be ground cover? Shouldn't there be plants on the ground? It's a good question.
So do you understand that method of tillage has been supplanted by no-till?
So how do you convince farmer, multi-generational farmer that you guys aren't bonkers?
The question is, how do you convince a multi-general farmer that we're not crazy?
Yeah.
Well, I've been working on it for about 12 years and I still haven't persuaded.
What I've learned from Buzz is that you do it slowly and steadily. They know their farms, and they know they don't want somebody coming in and telling them how to do things. And so you have to leave the decision up to the farmer, and you have to tell them that to do what they feel comfortable with. And that's why regenerative principles can be applied on a scale. Sometimes you are doing a cover crop but still applying nitrogen because that's what makes you comfortable. And then I think if you can convince them to do a small portion, usually they become converted to the idea after a year or two. Not always, but yes, Mr. Scott.
Farmers pay attention to that bottom line, and my experience. And I think going at it from a business perspective as well as the science behind things and the environmental sustainability that goes with that, I have to believe that is going to be very effective in convincing. And I think again, when you can go in and do a little small area and proof of concept. I had a question about two crops, peaches and tomatoes. Okay. Has anybody tried to look at applying those principles? And the reason I ask, I think the pesticide use on peaches is 35 pounds per acre and tomatoes are 18 pounds per acre. God, if you could ever save money there, you're going to get a bunch of people really convinced to push this. So I don't know. I know tomatoes are finicky as water. You got to have a lot of water. But they also, I would tend to believe they plant a cover crop and they use the winter wheat as a cover, and they don't mow it when they plant the crops to prevent the tomato plants from being blown over if there's a windstorm that they get up and then they mow it. So I would really think the tomato crop might have an option if you could convince somebody to just start. I just wondered if anybody's working on something like that, because those two crops are huge.
So the question is anybody looking at this, at these applying regenerative principles to growing peaches and tomatoes and maybe other crops too?
With high ag.
I'm sure there is. I'm not familiar with the research. As you search, when you're writing a lit review and you're looking at regenerative principles, you do see lots of different applications, but I haven't dug into anything in specifically. But I think that it's kind of cool because we're right at the beginning, really, of applying this knowledge to the farming industry. And I think a lot of people have a lot of hope that this is really going to change things. We say that and we get excited about USD certified organic and how it's going to save the world. And I'm not saying that, but I think if you can find something that's new and is going to help farmers save money, then I don't see why not jump into it. I think a big part just from my experience with tomatoes and peaches in particular, would be finding plants that would be good companions. And so I've heard it said before that dandelions are really good at producing calcium, that they leave a lot of calcium behind in the soil, and tomatoes need calcium to produce lycopene and things like that. Now, if there's research being done on that, I'm not sure. But if somebody were to jump into that, I think that would be really interesting. And then you have to look at the downsides. If you're growing a field of dandelions, that might cause problems for your neighbors, even if it is increasing your tomato crop, or it might cause problems for you down the road. So looking at this is pretty essential.
Yeah, you gotta balance, you gotta make sure you're keeping the beneficial, like parasitic loss for really important to controlling stink worms.
Right.
Stink bugs and things like that. So you got a lot of things to balance.
And it really is about mimicking nature. I mean, nature's been growing things fairly productively for a long time without our help. And so what we're trying to do is still feed 8 billion people, but use principles that mimic nature more efficiently in a domesticated setting. And it's just tricky. There are challenges. Yes.
I have a question about your chicken litter that's used on the farm. So what would be the source of that? I would imagine that if you're applying a lot of chicken litter, that's going to come from a pretty large chicken farm.
Yes.
As opposed to you with my turkey farm, I know how much litter they can produce. But my question is more from the risk analysis component of knowing that a lot of large poultry farms incorporate antibiotics into their feed. Is there a consideration of what you might be putting into the soil from the introduction of something like chicken litter, as far as then long-term consequences of antibiotic resistance or something like that?
So the question is, what other impacts might there be from applying something like chicken litter as an alternative form of nutrients, especially when you're looking at antibiotics and different things? That is a very good question. And I think you have to look at the farmer mindset and the scientist mindset and how they can intermingle but sometimes clash. The farmer's looking at saving money. Usually the farmer is not saying, I want to save the world. I think typically farmers realize that they have a better idea of what an impact food production has on the environment than we do, and they've had to make say that's the way it is. Otherwise, people are going to starve. And so, I think if they can save money using chicken litter, then they're going to do it.
I absolutely agree. I just think we need to make sure
I agree.
The source of that litter.
Yeah.
Talking from personal experience,
Yeah.
I almost died from a bacterial infection picked up on our farm that was resistant to antibiotics that they think was transferred from the fecal material from our turkeys into me via my cat.
And you'd hate to say, like, we're making all these positive changes, we're saving the world, and then to see a new problem crop up instead of keeping your eyes open on it.
So I think, thinking about how chicken litter is applied, could there be some kind of process involved that would break down some of these adverse components of it before it's added? Something to consider.
And then you really get into the soil science of it, because the chicken litter is a source of nutrients, but also it's feeding the bacteria and the fungi that are there because you're not tilling. And those microbial communities are really having the impact when you're talking about nutrient. There's nutrients in the soil that aren't available to the plants, and when you feed the bacteria, they're going to make those nutrients available. And so and hopefully in so doing, they'll start to neutralize some of those kind of harmful. There's going to be a lot of viruses in the chicken litter, and hopefully they're going to feed on those and neutralize those. But you're right, there are some things that could cause problems.
Sounds like
Yeah.
Well, I'm not against using litter like that. I definitely think we need to move away from the traditional nitrogen-based fertilizer.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree.
And is chicken production moving away from antibiotics now, or is it still, are they still?
I know when we were farming, we had lots of animals. We were a corporate farm, so we fed them what the company said to feed them, which was profit based, right? Because it all goes back to profit.
It's all about gains, weight gains per pound of feed, right?
It's not just that either, it's infectious disease in the flock. If one thing gets it, it spreads very quickly, so you just, try to suppress everything to begin with. But and to answer your question, a lot of farms are moving to antibiotic-free systems.
That would seem like the first suggestion to use that.
Yeah, and that's the consumer-based push most.
Two.
I've got a two-parter. First part, have you heard at least anecdotally if the regenerative farmers that you're working with see that their crops are more drought resistant and or more flood resistant?
Yes, anecdotally, I would say that most of them do believe that. Now, they also will tell us sometimes that their crop looked a little less robust or was less big and green. But we've found sometimes that like adding heavy nitrogen has a cosmetic effect on the plants, so they look a little bit more healthy and tall, but their yield is very close still. And so I think, yeah, anecdotally, you do hear things like this where well, like I said, when the nitrogen costs went up in 2021, those farmers just weren't really worried because they knew. And the same thing happens with a huge rain or a lack of rain. Yeah.
Daniel, one of the things that is a physical factor is because you've got soil cover as opposed to bare soil, your soil temperatures are much lower. So that reduces plant stress. The other component to that is when you've got soil that's covered, raindrop impact is negligible compared to bare soil. So you don't have loosening of soil, plus you've got a lot more infiltration. So that there's plenty of, I think, probably research as well. It's pretty well established.
Right. The second part, thinking from a disaster perspective, are regenerative farms potentially a flood mitigation control?
I initially would, so sorry, I keep forgetting to repeat the question for those on Zoom just in case they're here, but the question was, are farms using regenerative practices have the potential to mitigate floods? Theoretically, yes. I mean, if you've got plants that are pulling water from the soil and then plants are respiring as well, so they're letting that water out to the atmosphere, theoretically, yes, you should be able to absorb more water. And so we do a lot of water infiltration tests. We have a metal ring that you pound into the ground, and you put a measured amount of water all at once on it, and then you time how long it takes to go down. And some of these agriculture fields that are bare soil that have been driven with tractors driven over them for years and years and years are just almost like concrete, and you put water in there, and if you put an inch of water and it sits for an hour, that's telling about what's going to happen if there's an inch of water in 1 hour or in half an hour. Whereas if you have good root systems and good biology and diversity, that water is going to go down. And if you can absorb an inch of water in 5 seconds, you're probably in good shape in a storm.
Yeah, and there would be cascading impacts too, because floods and droughts can contribute to landslides, so you could be preventing secondary events as well.
And then if you have cover crops with deep roots that are pulling water from those stores and bringing it up, then you've got some benefits there. And maybe not as important here, but in the West, they talk all the time about, how can we access that water that's 6 feet down or 8 feet down and use it for our crops. So there's lots of implications. Yes, Dr. Shelley.
You were looking at costs associated with the input into things, right? Are you also looking at other costs in the system that are involved?
Yeah, so the question is, are we looking at costs other than just the input costs? And I would like to eventually build to have an idea of all the costs. Initially, because we haven't been doing expressly economic analysis for the last 10 years, We don't have access to all of those costs. We're trying to get more and more, because when you're looking at things through that lens of risk management, you're trying to minimize the unknown. So there's always going to be risk involved with what we don't know. But if we can look at the things that we do know as specifically as possible, then when we make those decisions, there's less unknown involved. And so eventually that would be great. Right now it's fairly limited. And so when I look at these charts, I see that, we've just got one piece of the map and the rest of it is still dark, but I hope so that eventually we can, because I think like Dr. Scott said, the economics are going to be what changes the farmer's mind. I think so.
At the end of the day.
Let's follow up about the carbon market. What is your opinion on that? How that's
I'm not familiar enough with it to take a hard stance, but from what I understand, if you're doing something that's going to sequester carbon, then you're given a tax break or something like that. Is that kind of how those work? Yeah. Uh-huh. Right.
Yeah, there's also.
I think if you can use carbon credits as an incentive, then that's a really great thing. I think, just making sure that it's balanced and that it's actually having an impact is important. And I think whether or not you're getting a credit, if it's helping you in other areas economically, and you're sequestering carbon, just because that's a lot of these farmers, they're not coming to Buzz and they're not saying, hey, we want to have a smaller carbon footprint. They're saying, hey, we don't have enough money to buy fertilizer this year. What can we do? And then we're like, hey, well, do you mind if we take soil tests and look at your carbon sequestration? And they're happy to let us because we saved them so much money.
Yeah, I was going to say too, one of the things that really struck me when you showed that water table with the soils, most of your nutrients leave the field absorbed with the sediment. So that erosion control is really important, particularly like Buzz was saying with the bare soil and the rainfall intensity. Our rainfall rates, like in New England, I think the average rainfall rate here across the U.S. has gone up 13% for the last 10 or 15 years. In New England, 60% more intense rainfall. And that is expected to increase because of these large mesoscale events that are sucking up moisture and the clouds are going higher in the atmosphere, thus the rainfall rate's higher. So we're going to see more of that, and that is a real buffer, literally, to protect the soil. But more importantly, also the nitrogen and phosphorus retention, because the NP ratio is what drives the toxin production in those algal blooms.
Right.
If you increase N to P, your toxin production per cell almost doubles. And that's what really affects shellfish and affects dogs and cats, people. Because a majority of illnesses, from HABs are in children. And, consumption of water when they swim because they're smaller. So anyway, those are all benefits that really should be considered for tax credits as well, besides the carbon. And
yeah, agreed. Yes.
Last question.
So I guess this is more about next steps. So for the farmer's insurance, would the next step be to present data like this to them and help reduce that economic risk to farmers?
So the question was, would the next step be to use this data to kind of bolster up farm insurance and things like that, so that farmers can do these things and have it be less risk? And I think that that's beginning to happen. I think that there's several $1 billion being spent over the next few years by government entities to try to look more at the effects of cover crop and see if it's something that can really to get the science up to speed. I think the government view of the science up to speed, because there's so much data, and so we've got to kind of catch up and make sure that, that the insurance agencies don't think that this is just craziness or hocus pocus, but that it's actually
There was a very strong debate about 7 or 8 years ago because there was no crop insurance for covers.
Mhm.
And so they had that discussion. So guys like Sunny, do have crop insurance now, but at one stage in the Middle East, now you should take crop insurance if you have that's changed.
And I would think with drought increasing that, they would probably encourage that. Because with drought, the frequency of drought increasing.
Yeah.
And Joe, you do have one.
this one here.
Question here, last more.
So if there's a way to pay farmers to grow coastal wetlands, if the so I'm just trying to understand. So if the farmers were to transition to coastal wetlands, is that what the question's asking?
I think that's what he is.
That's a good question. I don't have a lot of experience with coastal wetlands. I think anytime you change land into agricultural land or out of agricultural land, it's a big consideration. And so like a lot of the people who are against regenerative agriculture say, well, maybe you're sequestering carbon, but if your crop, if your yield is smaller, then if we say, we have a bunch of people go to areas in South America around the rainforest and say, well, you've got to use these regenerative principles, and they cut down a forest to grow crops regeneratively, that's not gonna have a benefit because that forest was already sequestering carbon. And so I'm not sure about coastal wetlands, but I think anytime you're transitioning in or out of agriculture lands, there's just a lot to consider, and we need to look at the incentives. Does that answer the question, Dr. Turner? Hope it does. Yeah, and I think anytime research can affect policy and can affect, make positive changes, that's good. So.
Okay, how about the last round? That was great, Joe.
Thank you.
Recall, and thank everyone for showing up. Recall that next week we do not have a seminar because of fall break. The following week on the 25th, we'll reconvene, and Dr. Bose is our distinguished seminar speaker. So we are looking forward to that. So thank you again, and folks, we are done.
All right, I'll go ahead and end this.